It seems to be recording, Stephanie.
Okay, I'll start then. So welcome everybody and thank you for coming along this afternoon. Before I introduce our speaker, I did just want to thank Stephanie Rossett, who's our UK Reproducibility Network UEA institutional lead, and also our local network leads from across the university, and they've organised today's and in fact the whole series of reproducibility seminars, so thank you to them. Also, these UKRN leads and colleagues have also been quite instrumental in the formation of a new research culture group at UEA. So that brings together colleagues from across schools and faculties with our professional services colleagues as well, looking at all sorts of issues from ethics, integrity, open research and lots of other topics as well. We're formally launching that group in January, and you're welcome to come along to that launch, which will be in the Enterprise Centre on January the 25th. And of course, you'll hear much more about that group as it gets going through 2023. So without further ado, we're delighted to welcome our speaker today. So Marcus is a professor of biological psychology at the University of Bristol, and his research interests are on pathways into and the consequence of health behaviours and mental health, with a particular focus on alcohol and tobacco use. His research has been hugely influential in policy debates. He also has interests in the incentive structures in science and how these shape the robustness and reproducibility of scientific research. So that probably explains why he is also the Associate Pro Vice Chancellor for Research Culture at Bristol, and also the chair of the National UK Reproducibility Networks Steering Group, and they coordinate the network's activities and strategy. So I'm sure Marcus will explain much more about this in his talk, and I look forward to hearing his thoughts and also perhaps his views on how UEA can continue and grow our knowledge and activity in this really important area. So over to you, Marcus.
Thank you very much. Well, it's a real pleasure to be invited to speak at one of our institutional members. I'll be talking mainly about the UK Reproducibility Network, as Fiona mentioned, and how we have evolved over the last almost 4 years of our existence. We're still a relatively young organisation, and in particular how we are now helping other countries set up their own reproducibility networks, modelled more or less along the same lines as UKRN, and bringing together those different national reproducibility networks into a global network of reproducibility networks. But some of the things that Fiona mentioned are relevant to how I got to this point. My own research included studies in many areas that turned out to be less robust than you might think from the published literature. And that was the first thing that made me think that there was more going on, if you like, than the conventional model of how research is meant to work, in terms of asking a question and applying a method and then getting an answer to that question and then reporting that honestly. And then the other thing that is relevant is that working at that policy interface, I learned that that sort of tendency for processes to be distorted by vested interests, personal beliefs and so on is particularly acute perhaps when you're talking about policies. And I think that's relevant in the context of the policies that we might want to see introduced to improve the way in which academia more generally operates, which is where this links to the wider research culture agenda. The point being that I think we need to be careful to make sure that we are carefully evaluating what we do as we go along, because things that might seem like good ideas, like setting up reproducibility networks, for example, might turn out to not work as anticipated, to even have potential unintended consequences, some of which may be positive, but some of which may be negative. So we need to be evidence-based in the way that we go and remind ourselves that we're, by definition almost, those of us that are involved in these issues around research culture, open research, and the quality of the research we produce, we are approaching it from a particular perspective and interpreting things through a particular lens. And we need to remind ourselves that that is exactly the kind of thing that can lead to some of those distorting influences that brought us to this place in the first place. So we're all well intentioned. We all want to improve things and how we do things, but we need to be self-reflective, self-critical, and willing to change our minds as we go. So in the spirit of that, I'll be spending the next 30 or so minutes talking about how we got to where we are and where we're going next. But then hopefully there'll be some time at the end for questions, for challenge, for comments, for ideas about what else we could do or what we might do differently. And I would welcome any comments that people have, and in particular, any challenges to anything that I say. So there's really a long history to this. It's worth bearing in mind that these questions around research quality and how we do research are not new. Charles Babbage wrote in the 1830s on his reflections on the decline of science in England as a kind of riposte to what he saw as the corruption of the Royal Society. So these debates have come around periodically over time, this idea that things are not as good as they should be. And of course, the mere fact that those debates happen doesn't mean that it's necessarily true. But it's worth, I think, reflecting on why this current debate, which to some extent can be traced back to 2005 and Johnny Ioannidis' article on why most published research findings are false, has gained more traction than those previous debates. That original article that I mentioned was very much focused on the biomedical space, but actually the conversations have extended not just to scientific disciplines more generally, but beyond that, to the social sciences, to the arts and humanities, and so on. And more recently, there was this Science and Technology Committee inquiry on reproducibility and research integrity that UK Reproducibility Network component parts submitted evidence to. And that indicates the extent to which these concerns that the way in which we work could be improved have reached quite a high level in terms of being debated in Parliament and reaching that level of policymakers. And I think the reason that that is important is twofold. One, because it emphasises just how much traction this current version of the debate has achieved, but perhaps more importantly, than if we ourselves as academics aren't on the front foot and shaping that debate and contributing to that debate and proposing solutions ourselves, we run the risk of solutions being imposed on us from the outside by policymakers who maybe don't fully understand the nuances of academia or the nature of academia. And that's probably not going to be the best outcome. Having said that, there's probably some value in having that external perspective. I don't think we should entirely mark our own homework, but I think we need to be part of that co-production of what the solutions might be. And of course, that fits into, as I said, wider debates around research culture. And there is a, for example, government R&D people and culture strategy that is relevant to that. We're seeing a lot more activity in the wider research culture space. But there's perhaps also an intersection with a conversation that maybe we haven't had as much as we should do, which is what should universities look like in the 21st century? What is the role of a university in society? And to what extent does that have to change to keep pace with change in society, the marketization of academia, the external demands that are placed on universities now? Some of those things we might not think of as good things necessarily, but that doesn't necessarily mean that we're going to be able to wish them away. So how can we get on the front foot and again come up with a positive, proactive vision of what we're for, how we can produce knowledge that is good quality, benefits society, advances our understanding of the world, and so on, in a way that allows us to continue to be universities rather than turn into something that we are not or don't want to be. So that's the wider context. And the result 4 years ago of those conversations reaching a particular critical point was that we launched the UK Reproducibility Network. And this was launched in March 2019. We had a launch event in King's College London, but it had been at least 5 years getting to that point. So people like myself, Dorothy Bishop at Oxford, Chris Chambers at Cardiff, Malcolm MacLeod at Edinburgh, people like that, had been lobbying funders for several years, saying that there was something that needed to be done to improve the quality of the research that we produce, and that wasn't happening, and that we were willing to take that role on if they could provide us some support to do so. There was an Academy of Medical Sciences meeting at the Wellcome, I think in 2015, that really got the ball rolling on those conversations. But it wasn't until late 2018 that we were able to get representatives from various funders, publishers, learned societies, and other sectoral organisations into a room together physically to talk about how we could address these issues. And that meeting was supported by JISC and held in Bristol. And there was a great deal of enthusiasm in the room from funders in particular, but also from these other organisations. They recognised that something should be done. But the problem was that no one organisation felt that it was entirely within their remit to take this on, which was why a consortium or collaboration of academics felt like the best solution, because we could then, with their support, take on that role of joining up what was already happening, identifying gaps and plugging those gaps with new activities, and coordinating and brokering conversations across the sector. So we received support from a range of funders. that would allow us to continue for 3 years. So from March 2019 until March of this year. And we had as a strategy that we would use that time to obtain more substantial programmatic funding that would allow us to move on to the next stage for a few more years. And we received that at the end of last year, which is our Researching and Development Fund project. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. But that means that we have funding for now slightly more than 4 more years. And part of that funding includes support for us to develop a longer term sustainability model so that we can hopefully carry on beyond that period. But it's great that there has been that level of support from a range of different funders, UKRI, the individual research councils within UKRI, and a range of other major funders like Wellcome, Cancer Research UK, and so on. So our approach is modelled to some extent on what became known in manufacturing as the Toyota process, and the principles of that are on the left-hand side here. So continuous improvement, respect for people, and in particular that the right process will produce the right results. Also developing people and partners, and that solving problems drives organisational learning. You can see hopefully how those principles apply quite generally, I think, to many things that we do, but in particular to the kind of work that we as the UK Reproducibility Network do. And that analogy between the research process and the manufacturing process, and how we can learn from other sectors like manufacturing, like aviation, was captured in this article that's shown at the top left, Scientific Rigour in the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, that was supported by a US funder that brought together a working group to discuss those issues back in 2013. But the point here is that our focus is very much on the research process. On the right, you can see a model that, that we sometimes use to describe research integrity, with research integrity being made up of these component parts of professional behaviour, so the behaviours of individuals, particularly around things like bullying and harassment and fraud and so on, managing risks, which is things like the trusted research agenda, which some of you may be familiar with, for example, and then the research process, how we actually do research. And that's the main area of our focus as the UK Reproducibility Network. And of course, that fits into research culture, institutional culture. It's worth saying that these things are not monolithic. You have different disciplinary cultures, different faculty and school cultures, different institutional cultures. So this is all quite fractal, but this simplification, I think, does the job for the purposes of what we're focusing on. So how is UKRN set up, and how do we use that structure to drive change and focus on research process? So there are 3 main parts to the UK Reproducibility Network. And again, Fiona in her introduction touched on a couple of those. First of all, we have our local networks. So these are informal, self-organising groups of researchers at individual institutions that come together to share effective practice, to run journal clubs, to run seminar series, and to create communities of practice on the ground, if you like, bringing together researchers from different disciplines, from different career stages, and also bringing together people who are part of the research process who are not necessarily in academic roles, people from professional services, library teams, ethics and governance teams, and so on. So we have those local communities, and we have those at, I think, about 65 universities across the UK at the moment. Then we have our institutional members, and institutional members are represented by institutional leads, with Stephanie being UEA's institutional lead, and they work at the senior management level, to some extent holding senior management's feet to the fire on these issues, looking at things like training, promotion criteria, other incentives. And the idea is that local network leads and institutional leads perform different functions, and ideally every institution would have both, with those 2 people working in partnership, challenging each other, advocating for each other, with the institutional lead being able to convey the voice of the grassroots community to the senior management team, but also the local network lead being able to convey some of the deliberations that are happening at the senior management level to that local community. So we see the 2 very much working in partnership. And then the third major grouping is our stakeholder engagement group. So this is the funders, the publishers. Oh, and I should say we have, I think, something like 30 institutional members at the moment. Of course, these numbers are changing all the time. And our stakeholder engagement group is made up of the funders, the publishers, the learned societies, organisations like Research Libraries UK and ARMA. So again, not just focused on the academic side, but also on the professional services and technical side, bringing together these different groups that operate at slightly different levels within the research ecosystem, if you like. And that structure allows us to coordinate what's happening both within and between those different elements, so we can get all of our local network leads, for example, to work in broadly similar ways, and we can support them through things like a residential retreat that we run once a year. Our institutional leads come together to talk about coordinating things like hiring and promotion criteria, because of course, researchers are mobile, so you want to, as much as possible, ensure that things that are incentivized at one institution are also incentivized at another institution. And we can create partnerships between funders and publishers. I'll talk about that in a bit more detail later. But we can also coordinate between these groups. For example, when UKRI was setting up the UK Committee on Research Integrity, we were able to put a number of our local network leads directly in contact with UKRI to give their perspective from the grassroots in terms of what they felt was needed by the sector from such a committee. So it's that coordination function and that ability to broker conversations and facilitate collaboration that we see as our major role. We have a steering group that is a small group of us who coordinate this activity. So myself, Malcolm McLeod, Chris Chambers, Alexandra Collins, Lara Fortunato, and Etienne Roche, who come from a range of different disciplinary backgrounds: anthropology, ecology, psychology, and biomedical science. And then we have an international advisory board that's chaired by Sarah de Rijker, and again, makes up a number of people from a number of different disciplines. So although our starting point was very much in the biomedical space, we're working very hard to be relevant across all disciplines and to create a structure that allows for that coordination, but is flexible enough to allow for local solutions, local implementation, because the universities that are part of the network range from the Royal Veterinary College through to UCL in Oxford, through to the University of Wolverhampton. So larger, smaller, more or less research intensive, quite a diverse range of institutions. So the key facts, if you like, are that we're very much a peer-led consortium. We're still effectively an academic collaboration that for the time being is hosted by the University of Bristol, that brings together researchers, institutions, and other organisations. Our focus is very much on collaboration to reform culture and practice, with that focus on the research process. And our aim is to focus on, at the moment, particularly open research, but to work in a way that is inclusive beyond the sciences so that we are relevant across disciplines. And this figure shows both our local networks and our institutional members, although, again, the figure is slightly out of date because these numbers are changing all the time. And you can also see the range of organisations that are part of our stakeholder engagement group, major funders, but then also other organisations like JISC, learning societies like the Institute of Physics, the Royal Society of Biology. So quite a broad range of different organisations that are part of that. And again, I'll talk a little bit later about how we're working with those organisations to broker conversations about new ways of doing things effectively. So I mentioned that open research, open science is a main area of focus at the moment. That funding that we received from Research England last year that supports us for another 5 years is intended to grow and embed open research practices across the sector by working collaboratively across the currently 20 universities that are part of that project, that are a subset of the 30 universities that are part of the UK Reproducibility Network. But we're expecting to grow the number of partner institutions who are actually directly involved in the project over the next few months. And the challenges of this are that local solutions are often excellent, but not necessarily interoperable across different institutions. So if we want to support open research, and this should really say open research rather than open science, because we're working much more broadly than in the STEM disciplines. First of all, we need high quality repositories. Now, there are lots of repositories out there. Some of them are from commercial organizations. Others are from non-profit organizations like the Centre for Open Science. But the problem with those is that those repositories provide the digital infrastructure, but don't provide any additional support in terms of, for example, checking deposits before they're archived. The Bristol repository is an example of a curated repository where a team that sits in library services scrutinizes every deposit before it's published. Now, we as a research group in Bristol, my own research group or the research group that I'm part of, we've been publishing, for example, data sets and codes for the best part of a decade. And we still submit things to our repository that have minor glitches in them. For example, a column of data that isn't critical for the analyses, but potentially could lead to re-identification. And the library team picks up on this. So even a relatively experienced research group that knows how to deposit data can still get things wrong sometimes. So having that support, that soft infrastructure, if you like, of people who actually check your deposit before it's published, I think is really critical. But it's the kind of thing that is not necessarily seen as critical by senior management teams and is expensive. So one of the questions we are asking is, to what extent can some of this support be provided centrally? Because one of the natural advantages that the UK has is that it's a relatively compact, well-connected research ecosystem already. And we already have some central solutions provided by organizations like JISC, for example, when it comes to digital tools that we use in our research. Another challenge is training. So this is where, in particular, our Research England project is hopefully going to allow us to make some progress. It's all well and good having the infrastructure in place, but you need to know how to use it. You need to know, for example, how to create a deposit that will be findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable, the FAIR acronym that you're seeing increasingly preferred over, for example, open data. So we need training that is consistent and can reach all researchers, so that all researchers are trained to do things in a broadly comparable way. Again, because researchers will move across organizations, and if the way in which things are done in one organization is radically different to the way in which things are done in another organization, that's simply going to create friction and inefficiencies for no particular benefit. If we could have some common approaches that are developed collaboratively that we can then scale across all institutions, that should improve not only the quality of what we do, but also the consistency and interoperability of what we do. So train the trainer courses are the approach that we're taking, whereby partner institutions can send in trainers from their academic staff or from their professional services staff, from library teams in particular, ideally from both and ideally across disciplines and career stages, to then go back to their organizations and deliver workshops on open research practices that can be tailored to the local organization, to the particular discipline, whatever it might be, but which will share some common DNA with the training that's being rolled out across all of the other partner institutions. And we've developed a series of open research primers that provide a starting point for those courses. And these are available on our website. So we have these for pre-registration and registered reports, for preprints, for open access publishing, data sharing, open code and software, and open research awards. And we are developing animations, video testimonials, and webinars to go alongside those, so that there will be layered content that allows people to dip their toe in if they're not familiar initially, work their way through to the point where they're given a basic overview of how to approach these issues in the primer, and then ideally attend a workshop that is delivered by someone who has been on the Train the Trainer course. We also need to think about how we then incentivize that. So it's all well and good providing the infrastructure and the training that allows people to do things, but we also need to incentivize those behaviors. So whilst we can say a priori that there are some benefits to open research, both in terms of increasing the reach of our work, but also improving efficiency and we think quality as well, but changing how people work takes effort. And so we need to incentivize that effort. And that's where things like promotion criteria and open research awards, the kinds of things that institutionals can push at that senior level, come into play. So one of the things that we're doing as part of our open research project is trying to harmonize promotion criteria and hiring criteria across our partner institutions, so that they all capture open research practices, for example, in those hiring and promotion criteria. Open research awards are also becoming quite popular. And one of the things that we're looking at is whether there can be regional clusters of institutions that can offer awards across the member institutions in that particular regional cluster to facilitate, again, collaboration, sharing of ideas, and so on. So the GW4 consortium of institutions, or group of institutions, which are 4 universities in the Southwest, Bristol, Bath, Exeter, and Cardiff, will be running a joint open research award from next year. And then finally, and this is really more of a guiding principle than a specific activity, it's this point about interoperability, which I've touched on in the context of training and touched on in the context of incentives. Researchers don't stay at the same institutions forever. So the open research practices that we're promoting and supporting need to be interoperable. And we can do that through the Train the Trainer courses. We can do that through the alignment of hiring and promotion criteria across institutions. But we've also developed a series of statements for institutional use that, again, are intended to help institutions adopt a common and interoperable approach when it comes to things like open research, transparency in research, when it comes to rewards and incentives and so on. So as well as resources for individual researchers on our website, there are also resources for institutions and for institutional senior management teams. So this is the Research England award that we received, like I say, at the end of last year, with the main focus being to accelerate the uptake of high quality open research practices and do that in a way that becomes embedded so that that activity continues beyond the lifetime of the award. And as I mentioned earlier, one of the things that is a central part of that award is the development of a longer term sustainability model for the UK Reproducibility Network so that we can continue that coordination and collaboration and brokering function that I talked about earlier. But it's really exciting that we got to this point. I have to say, you know, we started out with 3 years worth of pretty modest funding just to get ourselves off the ground. And it wasn't a given at the outset that we would get that longer term programmatic funding. So the fact that we did, I think, reflects the commitment on the part of UKRI and Research England to support this kind of activity. And it's gratifying to see that they recognise the value of that kind of collaborative, co-produced approach that's very much at the heart of what we're trying to do. So these are the partners on the Research England Award. These are the original applicants on the bid to Research England on the bottom right in terms of institutional members. But since then, other institutions that have joined UKRN are able to join the Open Research Programme. And we also have a number of other organisations that are providing direct support for that Open Research Programme. It's led by Neil Jacobs, who was at UKRI and brings a huge amount of experience from UKRI, but also from JISC and Coalition S, where he previously spent some time. We have a number of international partners, and these overlap largely, but not completely, with our stakeholder engagement group. So the Open Research Programme is led by UKRN, but it's not quite exactly the same thing as UKRN, if that makes sense. And so the programme of work, which will extend to the end of August 2026, is training, as I've mentioned, via those train-the-trainer workshops that we'll be running, evaluation of that training and the impact and uptake of that training, sharing effective practice across institutions, with a particular focus on management, governance, things like hiring and promotion criteria. And these are very much iterative workflows with, again, that principle of self-reflection and continuous assessment being built into what we'll be doing over the next now 4.5 years. So those iterative cycles and those feedback loops between the different strands of work are an important part of it. And you can see the detail here across the 3 different work streams: training, evaluation, and sharing practice. We've already begun to make progress in terms of, for example, identifying what training currently exists and what training priorities are recognised by individual institutions and researchers. We've designed a survey instrument on open research practices that we'll be launching shortly across our partner institutions, and we're bringing material together into a living website that captures a snapshot of where individual partner institutions are and will eventually allow us to share training resources. And if you're interested in where we've got to with the Open Research Programme, we'll shortly be posting a news item on our website that brings you up to date on where we've got to so far, and we'll be posting updates every couple of months to let the world know where we've got to with that programme of work. So that's where we've got to in terms of UKRN and our Open Research Programme. And I'll talk briefly now about some other initiatives that we support. So there are a number of initiatives that we support that are not our initiatives, but are things that we feel are relevant to what we're trying to achieve and that we can help to promote, amplify, and extend the reach of. So one of those is the registered reports submission format. So many journals now, as many of you will know, offer registered reports. These focus on the research question and the methodology. In other words, is the question important and is the methodology robust? And acceptance is effectively offered on the basis of that rather than what the results actually show. So peer review happens before data collection, and in principle acceptance is offered before data collection begins, meaning that when you start your study, you can do so safe in the knowledge that the results will be published pretty rapidly, as long as you stick to the plan or justify any deviations from the plan. And it doesn't matter what the results turn out to be, because the guiding principle is that if the question's important and the methodology is robust, then the results will be informative no matter what they actually are. But of course, that focus on the question and the methodology is very similar to what funders focus on when they make funding decisions. So we've been developing these registered reports funding partnerships that bring together funders and journals to create a single harmonized review process, where the funder review process is linked to the stage 1 registered report submission at a partner journal. Now, there are a few different versions of this. For example, the decision making can be devolved entirely to the funder and the journal simply accepts that, or the decision making can be devolved entirely to the journal and the funder accepts that. But the model that we've been piloting is one that leaves the funder review process largely intact, but of those applications that are recommended for funding that have opted into the pilot, they are handed over to a journal and offered the option of a stage 1 registered report submission straight away. And of course, that's quite good timing, because A, it's happening at the point where you're excited because you've got a grant, so you're full of energy and enthusiasm. B, you'd be developing the protocol for your study anyway at that point, typically before the funding can be activated because of the contracting process. C, we can potentially use some of the grant reviewers to look at the stage 1 submission to the journal, who will have already seen the grant proposal, and therefore it won't be that onerous for them to look at the stage 1 submission again. All of these things are empirical questions, of course, which is why we're looking at this and evaluating whether or not our assumptions actually hold. And in fact, one of the possibilities is that reviewers who basically like a grant and want to get it funded might hold back from making any critical comments because they don't want to scupper its chances of being funded. But if they get to look at the stage 1 submission a few months later, they can say, oh, well, I loved your project, but I thought you could do this differently. And of course, by making that comment before data collection begins, they can improve the quality of the study. So that kind of relay race model, where the project is handed over from funder to journal, is probably the lightest touch version of a registered reports funding partnership. So there are these different models, but the one that we're doing is the one that is best conceived of as a kind of relay race, that combined model. And the pilot we've been running has been with Cancer Research UK, which is obviously a major biomedical funder. And we've had a number of journals partner with Cancer Research UK, from Wiley, Springer Nature, and PLOS. Quite high profile journals, the kinds of journals that people would be very keen to publish in for the most part. And there's a great deal of autonomy that remains with the applicant. So for example, they choose which journal they elect to submit their stage 1 registered report to from the range that are available to them if they get a positive funding decision. And of course, the questions that we are asking in our evaluation are, well, what does the funder think about this process? What do the grant reviewers think about this process? What do the journals and journal editors think about this process? What do the journal reviewers think about this process? And perhaps most importantly, what do the applicants think about this process? The hope is that in time, we will also be able to collect metrics on whether this improves the speed with which results are published, because the hope is that people won't need to hawk their results around multiple journals at the end of data collection because they will already have in principle acceptance at one. Is the quality of studies improved by having gone through this process? But because this pilot has only been running for a few months, it will obviously take time before we can get to the point where the results start to emerge in the published literature. But over time, the hope is that we can evaluate that, all those different dimensions as well. So one of the things that I think is quite exciting about this is the scale of the project compared to some other registered reports funding partnerships. 13 different journals that are involved, 2 different committees in Cancer Research UK, and in fact, they've been so impressed by the pilot so far, I think they're going to extend that to another 4 committees. It's made easier for the funders and journals because their processes remain intact, and there's just a degree of harmonization and coordination between those processes. There's the option to retain reviewers, which makes it potentially easier to find reviewers for the journals. And there's a great deal of autonomy that's retained by the applicants/authors, depending on where they are in the process. So those are the kinds of partnerships that we're developing between members of our stakeholder engagement group. But of course, all of the things that I've been talking about fit within a wider context, which is that research is an international or global enterprise. And the partnerships with journals, I think, bring that into stark relief because, of course, journals operate globally, even if funders, for the most part, operate nationally. So one of the most exciting developments over the last year or so is that we've seen a very rapid growth in the number of national reproducibility networks that have emerged. And in fact, this figure is out of date already because we now have national reproducibility networks in Norway, in Denmark, in Belgium, in Canada, and there is the Helios group, which is a group of universities in the UK, in the US, committed to open research that are not formally a reproducibility network, but are structured very similarly to at least one part of our reproducibility network structure. And they've come into this, this group of national reproducibility networks that meet regularly to talk about national level coordination. And one of the exciting things that we saw recently is that there is a Horizon Europe funding call out that specifically asks for bids from reproducibility networks. Now, I don't think there are any other reproducibility networks than the ones that we've been involved in setting up. So effectively, that call was written with us as a family of reproducibility networks in mind. That doesn't mean it'll be slightly awkward if we don't get funding, but we're applying to that to support in a similar way to how Research England has supported our national activity within the UK. We're applying to that mechanism in the hope that it will provide funding to support the coordination of activity across European countries. So it feels like a really exciting time. We've come a long way, I think, in 3.5 years. But much of that momentum has been built by the fact that one of the things that we were very keen to ensure throughout was that we were tapping into, but also listening to that community of grassroots researchers that really were instrumental in making sure that this conversation, this debate, reached the level that it has done. So I think that community of local networks in particular is a big part of what gives us our legitimacy and allows us to sanity check effectively some of our ideas, because it's very easy, I think, for people in more senior positions to come up with proposals that they think are good ideas, but to do that in a way that is detached from the realities on the ground. And I think we need to be doing a better job of talking across disciplines, across professional academic services, professional services, technical staff, and so on, and just making sure that we are having more of those feedback loops in terms of the conversations that we have, so that we are all better informed by the realities that exist at those different levels and across those different elements of the research system. So hopefully our structure helps to facilitate that, but it does feel like a really exciting, positive time for what we're trying to do, with a great deal of momentum behind it. And that's why it's so great to have universities like UEA on board and to be able to come and speak to you about what we're doing, where we plan to go next, and to hear what you think we should be doing. Thank you.
Thank you, that was excellent. So are we opening up for questions?
Yes, I'd be, excuse me, happy to answer any questions. I hope that was all clear. It was there's a lot crammed in there, but hopefully it made sense. I don't know how you want to do questions. I know there are people in the room and people online, so.
Yeah, we could first go with people online, but I think there's something in the chat. Let me see, from Anna Collins. So Anna's question is that reproducibility, open research, and fair data clearly overlap but are not the same. Is the remit of UKRN broader than just reproducibility, and does including the reproducibility in the network's name risk affecting engagement with some disciplines, for example, arts and humanities, or research areas where open data, for example, is not an option for reasons of security, safety, confidentiality, etc.?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and there's a lot in there actually. So first of all, the name. I mean, in many ways it's not ideal because reproducibility has certain connotations, but I think one of the challenges with the word reproducibility is that it means different things to different people. But that's also one of the opportunities, because it means that we can then just basically say how we define it. The way that we define it is very much by holding it lightly and thinking of it in terms of, can you actually look inside the research process, if you like? Can we make the research process transparent, where people's assumptions, decisions, choices are laid out for others to scrutinize, so that other people could go in there and say, well, I would have done something differently, or I think something else at this decision point in the process. And I think that wider definition of reproducibility, which is really about transparency, can be applied across disciplines ranging from the arts and humanities all the way through to STEM disciplines. And we've had some quite interesting conversations with people in the arts and humanities, with the practice research community, with the Arts and Humanities Research Council along those lines. And actually, when it's sort of laid out in that way, it generally lands quite well, that it's about transparency and foregrounding the assumptions that are often implicit or not made explicit in our research. And this is actually, I think, linked to one of the key points about how we try to work, which is that every discipline can learn from something else. So in many disciplines in the humanities, for example, the idea of positionality statements, of foregrounding the perspective that you bring to a particular piece of scholarship, a piece of research, is well understood in a way that it often isn't in quantitative STEM disciplines, because scientists like to fool themselves into thinking that because they deal with numbers, they're terribly objective, when in fact, of course, scientists are just as subjective and biased as everyone else. So that learning can go in both directions. You know, there are disciplines that can teach people in STEM disciplines about things like positionality and just reflecting on the perspective that you bring to your own research and how that shapes your decision making and your interpretation. And in the other direction, to talk about open data, I mentioned that increasingly people talk about FAIR data, findable, accessible, interoperable, reusable. The University of Bristol repository, and not every repository has this functionality, but the Bristol one allows for 3 different levels of access: open, and then restricted and controlled, and I can never remember which way around that is, but the middle one, you have to request the data, but as long as it's a sort of credible request from a credible researcher, the data can be released. But at the highest level, when you're dealing with sensitive data, the issues of security, safety, and confidentiality that you mentioned, those data then will only be released if the Data Access Committee agrees to it under a data transfer agreement that provides a degree of control and safety around that. So those different levels of access mean that the data can be fair, findable, accessible, interoperable, reusable, with a digital object identifier, with a brief description, but you can't actually access the data unless it's appropriate to do so. So I think that is a solvable issue, but again, one where we need to be having conversations with people who've been part of those conversations in the context of the infrastructure that you need to support that. So to go back to the point about trying to engage with other disciplines, and in that context that I talked about, we prepared this series of case studies, and this was very much following on from Emily Farron's work at the University of Surrey, who produced a document on open research across disciplines. These are a series of vignettes that basically show what open research looks like across different disciplines, modelled on the UOA units of assessment that are part of the REF. So it's pretty much every discipline that we have across the sector in the UK, and that is part of how we're trying to engage with a broad range of disciplines to show how open research, broadly defined and so on, can be relevant to everybody.
Thank you very much, Marcus. I think the illustrating the vignettes is specifically going to be very helpful to those who may have limited awareness of reproducibility in action, in practice. Any other questions from our online guests? There are a couple from the room, so we would like to ask you to expand a little bit on the role of on how to involve people from professional services, on how they could contribute and we could benefit from our relationship.
Yeah, well, I mean, the most obvious community is the library team community that exists. Research Libraries UK is one of our stakeholder organisations, but within every university there will be a library team that supports open research, open access publishing, data sharing, and so on. That will be larger or smaller depending on how well resourced that particular institutional library is. But in my experience, they are delighted when academics reach out and say that they would like to work with them to raise the profile of open research, because often what they do is under-recognized, underappreciated by many researchers, not intentionally, but simply because they're not aware of the fact that all of this support and knowledge exists. So that's a helpful comment. Yes, it's not always in library services, but you know, those teams are out there somewhere, and we might need to do a little bit of work to find them. But they're generally, in my experience, very keen to collaborate with academics. That's one example. I think technicians in lab sciences is another example. People who hold a huge amount of knowledge, often have been around for a long time and really know, you know, how things work, and they're very keen to be part of those kinds of conversations. Ethics and governance teams will, again, in my experience, be delighted to work with you on how to make sure your information sheets and consent forms are appropriate if you want to share data under some level of access as is appropriate, and they can help with that conversation around what level of access is appropriate for different types of data. So, you know, this is really a community effort, and I think we need to see ourselves all as part of one team working collaboratively rather than distinct bubbles that keep to themselves.
Yes, thank you. It really sounds like an opportunity to get together and do something positive. Marcus, there was another question. So you have earlier said that training needs have already been identified. So it would be good to know more about this. What sort of, in what direction training could go?
Yeah, so some of it is around newer initiatives that are probably not as widely relevant as some other open research practices. So registered reports, for example, is something that is an area that is newer when it comes to the sort of open research portfolio, and where people feel like they know less than, say, open access publishing, which has been around for a while. I think there are also some interesting conversations around how widely that registered reports format can be applied. So there have been registered reports of qualitative studies, because the guiding principle of registered reports is that you lay out in advance what you expect to do, but it's not meant to be binding exactly. It's just meant to foreground your upfront assumptions, if you like. So that conversation around where and when registered reports can be applied, I think, is really helpful, really interesting. But that's one area where there's a lot of interest. Another is in data sharing, because not that that's such a recent phenomenon, but it's increasingly being mandated by funders. And because it's being mandated, people feel I should get on top of this. And that's one area where we're seeing a lot of demand. So we're piloting these train-the-trainer workshops at the moment. And one of the ways in which that could work is, again, there could be regional clusters. So again, in the Southwest, we're piloting this across the GW4 institutions, because if those institutions are physically close, it becomes possible to bring people together to attend those workshops in person rather than virtually. Virtual is fine, but I think there's something valuable about creating those communities that can come together, develop their own workshops to deliver back at their host institution, but can retain that sense of being a community even after they disperse, so that they can stay in touch via Slack channels or Teams, or any of these multitude of technologies that exist to allow us to do that. So having those regional communities of practice focused on delivery of training, I think, is going to be a really exciting output of this if we can get that traction.
Yeah, and you've also talked about the 5-year plan, so where we have to be in by 2026. Anything to add on in terms of what we could do to get there?
Well, I think at one level we need to grow our network of institutions and local networks. Secondly, I think we need to also start to provide more support for our local network lead, because those are quite a diverse bunch. They're mostly early career researchers, but not exclusively. You have some PhD students and postdocs, but also some lecturers. Now, lecturers tend to be in permanent positions. Postdocs on external funding obviously have fixed term funding, so that creates very different scenarios in those two cases. People on permanent positions can have their local network lead role incorporated into a workload model in a way that's more difficult for someone who is externally funded. So those are some of the challenges. We need to get universities to start supporting their local network leads in whatever way is appropriate for that particular community. So that growth needs to also include a degree of increasing support from institutions. And what we hope to do is to demonstrate the value of those individuals and those communities to those institutions so that they put their hand in their pocket effectively. And then we need to start to embed the training that we're talking about, but also the implementation of that training, evaluate whether or not the training that we're providing and the infrastructure that we're pointing at people to actually leads to a downstream change in what people are doing over time. And then at the end of that process, we need to see how we can then move ourselves onto the next phase where UKRN continues to do that supporting and nurturing and evaluating, but without having to go back to Research England and ask for a few £1 million every 5 years. So what's that going to look like? Will we need institutions to provide us with some support directly? At the moment, institutions can join without having to pay anything, but we'll have to see what the future holds. Do we need to start charging for some services? So we'll have to have a conversation with the communities that are part of UKRN to see what might be possible going forward. But the main thing at this stage is growing the network, providing that support, and making sure that we're evaluating the impact that our training and other activity is actually happening.
Thank you. Any other questions in the chat box? Let us know.
If I can, I may ask a question, Marcus, since I've got you here. It might be slightly controversial, but I can shake the tree a bit. I guess maybe it's like two questions. So one of the things that I've heard from many people is like, this is a lot of work, but does it actually change anything in the end? And I'm sure you've heard that before. And I know there's some evidence, you know, in terms of replication that the number of, you know, null effects goes up when you have pre-registrations. But so I guess, is there like any other evidence at the moment that can help us justify why going through all this work, which is a huge, you know, change in our process, I guess, which I agree with, but, you know, do you have a top kind of pitch to the more skeptic crowd? And then the other question was related to how do you see the ref changing to accommodate this? Because if that's not going to change, then it's going to be very hard for us to argue that we need to change, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, so to the first question, there is an increasing amount of meta research showing that open research practices do improve quality, or at least don't result in a distorted, biased literature where it looks like everything works perfectly. So there is that reason. But I think there are other reasons to engage in open research practices regardless of that. One is just the moral reason that the research that we do is largely funded by taxpayers, and whether that's through our salaries as academics via student fees, that's still ultimately, if you go far enough back, taxpayer funded, or whether it's through grants from UKRI, which is more directly so. So there is a moral imperative to make what we do available to the people who funded it in the first place, I would argue. Then there's the scope for our materials to be reused, and that's not always going to be in ways that you expect. We found out that one of our data deposits had been downloaded by a school and used for a secondary school science class as a demonstration, which is great because we wouldn't have thought of that, but actually it was used in that way. So you never know how people are going to use your data. And then the selfish reason, and it's Florian Markowitz just down the road at Cambridge who says this, you know, if you work in these ways, if you curate your data sets so that they are going to be made fair, you have to make sure that they can be understood by anybody. And that includes yourself 6 months from now. You know, I have colleagues who go back to their data sets and can't remember what variable 1 was because they haven't written it down anywhere. So curating stuff in this way improves your internal processes, makes it easier to onboard new researchers, makes it easier for you to go back to something and make sense of it 6 months or 6 years later. Florian's quote is, you know, your most important collaborator is yourself from 6 months ago, and that person doesn't answer emails. So working in that way, I think, benefits you directly, just because of the efficiencies that you eventually create. So you're right, there's a local minimum to get out of your current way of working, and the new way of working, there's a bit of effort to get from A to B. But once you're in that new way of working, I think the efficiencies will pay back that investment pretty quickly. In terms of REF, I mean, remember, Research England runs REF. They are very on board with open research. And I have to say, many of the things that people describe as a problem of the REF are actually problems that universities inflict on themselves. It's not the REF per se, but it's how we react to it that's problematic. The flip side, of course, is that it's understandable that universities react that way when there's so much money on the line. But I think there are some really interesting conversations happening in terms of what the next REF might look like. One of the ideas that's, I'd be amazed if it happens, but it's still on the table, so it might do, and I think it will be really radical, is instead of people submitting their best work, they just do spot checks. So universities don't have to spend any time selecting stuff. They just will come into whatever system you use, Pure or whatever else, and say, we're going to have these 10, 400, whatever articles, we would like to look at those. And that spot check is much closer to, again, the analogy of manufacturing. If you want to invest in a company, you don't go to the owner of the company and say, show me your best 5 things. You do some spot checks, because that gives you a much more accurate sense of the quality of the process. So I think that kind of radical change might be part of the next REF. But one of the things that is definitely going to be part of it is much more of a focus on the environment, and that includes support for things like open research practices. So I think institutions that get on the front foot and start to embrace these ways of working are going to be pretty well positioned for the next REF.
That's great. Thanks, Marcus. I've got my pitch now. Thanks very much for giving the talk.
It was a real pleasure, and I'm sorry I couldn't be there in person, but next time I'm out east, I will drop you a line. If anyone's got any questions, please do email me. Look on our website. You know, I'm always keen to help if I can. So thank you again.
Thanks very much. It was very interesting to get the sense of the bigger picture and purpose of our initiative expressed so eloquently and passionately. Thank you very much, Marcus. Really appreciate it.
Bye-bye. Have a good weekend, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thank you, Marcus. Thank you, Shafag.